In this third video on the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, we'll look at his domestic policies. In many respects, his domestic policies reflected his Democratic Republican ideological beliefs. He worked to encourage a nation of self-sufficient land-owning farmers. He did not embrace the urban commercial type of government that the Federalists wanted. Jefferson, he welcomed anybody to the White House. He didn't just let people of social stature come in, which was a break from Washington and Adams before him, and he refused to give a direct talk to Congress. He relied on his small cabinet for a lot of his decisions, which included, shown here from the left, James Madison as Secretary of State, Levi Lincoln as Attorney General, Henry Dearborn as Secretary of War, and Robert Smith as Secretary of Navy. But the person that was probably most important in implementing Jefferson's domestic policies was his last member of his cabinet, Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin, shown here. Interestingly, you can see on the left his portrait, and he lived a long life, and by the time he passed, there was beginnings of photography, and so you can see what he looked like on the right here as well. It's amazing how well these painters did. If you've been to Washington, D.C., right next to the White House is the old Secretary of Treasury building, and right in front of that is the statue of Albert Gallatin, so he plays a prominent place in Washington, D.C. With Gallatin leading the way, Jefferson abolished all internal taxes, and that included the hated whiskey tax, which had caused so much trouble during Washington's presidency. That left only tariffs and Western land sales as the federal government's source of income, and the tariffs were lowered as well. Jefferson cut the Army budget by half. The Army was down by the time he left office to only 3,300 people, and the Navy budget was cut by 2/3. Adams had built up several men of war, but by the time Jefferson left office, the Navy was nothing more than a small fleet of independent gunboats. He closed 2 of the 5 existing American diplomatic missions, closing the embassies at The Hague and Berlin, and he also cut the White House executive branch staff, which was already small. He cut it even more. By cutting the expenses, Jefferson was able to lower the national debt. He had hoped to wipe it out, but he reduced it from $83 million to $45 million by the time he left office in 1808. And here you have a graph of the national debt all the way through 2015 as a percentage of the GDP. As everyone expected of the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson and his congressional allies repealed the Alien and Sedition Acts that the Federalists had passed late in their time in office. And the Alien Sedition Acts were, causing so much anger. Here's a cartoon showing legislators fighting over the laws, but everybody expected they'd do that, and Jefferson did. He repealed it. Jefferson, however, did upset some members of his own party because they thought he had not gone far enough in weakening the federal government's power. For example, Jefferson agreed that he would not try to end the first bank of the United States, which the Federalists and Hamilton had established with a 20-year charter. Jefferson said he would just wait out the charter and then let it die on the vine. He also decided to let the funding and assumption issues, which had been agreed to during Washington's presidency, continue as they were, sort of yielding to arguments that establishing and maintaining national credit was important. Jefferson's handling of the Yazoo land debate really angered many Democratic Republicans. The Georgia legislature had granted Western lands to the Yazoo Land Company, and many of the legislators who granted this lands to the Yazoo Land Company had a personal investment in it, and they sold it. They allowed the purchase for only $500,000, and it covered 35 million acres, and it came to only a penny per acre. So those legislators were benefiting by having these Western lands granted by the legislature to this Yazoo Land Company. The company had then sold some of these lands to innocent third parties. Well, A new Georgia legislature came in, and seeing that this was kind of fraudulent, they voted to rescind the original grant. And this upset, of course, the Yazoo Land Company, and they sued. Many Democratic Republicans wanted the case heard in the Georgia state courts, but Jefferson agreed that the case should go forward in the federal court system. And the federal court system ultimately decided that the new Georgia legislature could not rescind the original grant. But the fact that Jefferson had wanted the case decided in the federal courts, not the state courts, seemed like something that a Democratic Republican president would want, and it angered many of people in his own party. One of the people that it angered the most was an old friend and business partner of Thomas Jefferson, the Virginian John Randolph. Randolph was Speaker of the House at the time, and he really objected to Jefferson's position as having the federal courts rule on the Yazoo land claim, and he became quite the critic of Jefferson. He's an interesting figure who was elected to Congress only in his 20s, and he was Jefferson's actual cousin, so they had a real connection. But this Yazoo Land Company really upset Randolph, and he broke with Jefferson and founded what he called the Tertum Quids, which is a faction in the Democratic Party that called for a return to, quote, the principles of 1798, unquote, and renounced what it saw as Jefferson's creeping nationalism. As Jefferson's presidency passed, there was also evidence that the country was developing sort of against Jefferson's ideological Democratic Republican beliefs. The Industrial Revolution was just beginning in the United States, and it sort of encouraged a more urban, commercial, manufacturing-based economy, not the nation of self-sufficient, independent yeoman farmers that Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans had imagined. A big boost to the Industrial Revolution had first occurred in England when James Watt invented the first steam engine in 1765. And in Britain, this steam technology had been applied to textile machines, and so they were steam-powered textile, what we might call a factory was developing, and it required trained workforce. By the way, James Watt is where you get the idea of wattage from. In Great Britain, the application of James Watt's steam power to the textile industry and the machines that were run by the steam power was proprietary. They didn't want that information, that technology getting out. Well, one worker there named Samuel Slater, he came over to the United States in 1790, and what he'd done is he had memorized the technology and how to do it, and he disguised himself to avoid the British authorities and came to the United States and replicated it in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So basically, Pawtucket was sort of the first American factory. It employed a lot of the wage workers and empowered steam and both water power. Here you can see one of the machines that was powered there, but this factory was an indication that America was changing, and it really encouraged more mass production in machines. In 1807, steam power was applied to boats by Robert Fulton, and this, of course, is quite revolutionary. His Claremont, you can see here, had a paddle wheel that was powered by steam. Now, having a steam boat is so important because you can now go easily against a stream upriver. Now, if you're going downriver, you can just let the tides get you. But if you're trying to get a boat to go upriver, say upriver on the Hudson River, sailing boats would have to tack or be pulled by a horse on the side. It's very difficult to go up against the current. But a steamboat could go up quickly, and that dramatically improved commerce. One of the ironies of Jefferson's presidency was his personal reliance upon slavery and his realization at the same time that it didn't mesh with his vision of a nation of independent yeoman men. Jefferson hoped personally that slavery would fade in the new nation. The Constitution had assured that the foreign slave trade would exist for 20 years after ratification. As this 1808 deadline approached, Jefferson encouraged and won a law continuing the ban. What I've got shown here is on the left an ad that Jefferson had put out as a as a planter trying to get his runaway people to find his runaway slave. And that shows you that he personally, he needed slavery and he knew he needed it. On the right was the law that banned the foreign slave trade after 1808, which Jefferson signed. It's really interesting that Jefferson was so personally invested in slavery and yet didn't like it so much and hoped it'd go away. Another key invention was the cotton engine, commonly referred to as the cotton gin. It was invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney, and by Jefferson's presidency, it really had transformed the cotton industry. You could put the twigs and the leaves and the fiber all into the top of the cotton gin, turn a handle, and it moved these cone-like structures against in opposite directions, peeling out the seeds and the twigs and leading only the fiber. And cotton was in huge demand because of the growth of the textile industry, as I just said, up north and also in Great Britain. So they needed a lot of cotton, but the cotton would have to have these seeds and these twigs pulled out, and that was quite laborious. So this was a way to get cheaper cotton to the textile factories and encourage the textile industry. Eli Whitney was an inventor of a number of things, including interchangeable parts for guns, and he was from Connecticut, and he didn't like slavery. But an irony of this was that his invention then led to the spread of slavery southwest into the new territories of Louisiana and Alabama. There, these areas, of course, still needed people to produce the cotton. And the cotton gin didn't do anything about growing and managing the cotton. And so slavery came along with the spread of the cotton industry. And that was, kind of ironic that a guy against slavery helped lead to the spread of slavery. And this was obviously unfortunate for the United States and against what Jefferson had hoped. Critical to Jefferson's vision of the future was an America that was educated and open-minded. And Jefferson promoted public education all across the United States, and he designed and helped charter the University of Virginia, very near his Monticello, Virginia home, Charlottesville. And here you can see the rotunda that was his library, and it still exists today. Also working against Jefferson's vision of a nation of independent farmers, all well educated, was the Second Great Awakening. Like the First Great Awakening earlier, it was an emotional religious revivalism. There were these preachers that would travel around or have around these and set up tents, and people would come out and there'd be fire and brimstone. And it was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, the idea that people were just cogs in another machine, that God did care about you. But it was an emotional-driven, anti-intellectual movement in many respects, and that arguably worked against Jefferson's vision. The Second Great Awakening empowered women, by the way. In any event, this concludes the video on Jefferson's domestic policies.